The stars above Earth had always been silent, and for all of human history, that silence had been a comfort. But on the morning of March 14th, 2031, the silence ended forever. It began with a shadow. The International Space Station was the first to see it, a darkness spreading across the face of the sun like a stain on glass, growing wider and deeper until the instruments screamed with readings that made no sense at all, and the crew pressed their faces to the windows and saw what no human had ever seen before. Ships, thousands of them, hanging in the black like a wall of iron teeth, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, each one humming with a light that was not fire and not electricity, but something older and stranger and far more terrible. They stretched from one edge of the visible sky to the other, and they were so vast that they bent the light around them, and the shadows they cast fell upon the earth like the hand of something that did not care whether the things beneath it lived or died. Within the hour, every screen on the planet lit up with the same message. It came in every language, every dialect, every form of communication humanity had ever used: radio, television, digital signals, even old shortwave frequencies that had not been active in decades. And the voice that spoke was calm and smooth and carried the tone of someone reading a grocery list. "This world is now claimed under the authority of the Valith Dominion," the voice said. "You are species 4417 in our registry, and your planet has been designated Resource Node 6012. You will disarm all military forces within 72 hours. You will present your ruling caste for integration processing, and you will comply with all further directives without delay. Resistance is noted in our records as statistically irrelevant. This transmission will not repeat." And then there was silence again. But it was a different kind. Silence now, the kind that comes before thunder. In Washington, the president stared at the screen and said nothing for a very long time, before turning to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and asking a single question: how long until they land? In Moscow, generals who had spent their entire careers preparing for a war with each other suddenly realized that none of those plans mattered anymore, and they began making new ones. In Beijing, the Central Military Commission convened within the hour, and for the first time in modern history, the red phones connecting East and West rang not with threats, but with a single desperate word: together. The United Nations held an emergency session that lasted 9 hours, and in those 9 hours, more was accomplished than in the previous 9 decades. Old grudges were set aside, not because they had been forgiven, but because they had suddenly become very, very small. A new command structure was born that night. Called it the Unified Terran Command, or UTC, and it brought together every military force on the planet under a single authority for the first time in human history. American carrier groups, Russian nuclear submarines, Chinese missile batteries, Indian special forces, British intelligence networks, Israeli cyber warfare units, and 100 other forces that had spent generations learning to kill each other, now turned their eyes upward and saw the same enemy. The Valith waited in orbit with the patience of a species that had done this 900 times before. Ambassador Commandant Uvril stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Decree, and watched the little blue world turning slowly beneath him. It was a pretty planet, he thought, rich in water and minerals and biological diversity, and it would make an excellent addition to the Dominion's holdings once the local species had been properly subdued. He had reviewed the intelligence reports on humanity, the mild interest of a bureaucrat processing paperwork. A fractured species divided into competing nations, still burning fossil fuels and splitting atoms for power, incapable of faster-than-light travel, limited to their own star system, and apparently spending most of their time arguing with each other about invisible lines drawn on their single inhabited world. It was almost sad, he thought. They had some potential, perhaps, in a few thousand years. But right now they were nothing more than the 900 species to be folded into the Dominion's vast empire. His aide approached and informed him that the 72-hour deadline was approaching, and that no surrender delegation had been detected. Yuvrel waved a hand and told the aide to be patient, because the primitives were probably still arguing among themselves about who would have the honor of kneeling first. But then the communications officer spoke up, and there was something in her voice that made Yuvrel turn around, a note of confusion that he had never heard before in all his years of service. "Ambassador Commandant," she said, "we are receiving a transmission from the planet. It is not a surrender." Yuvrel raised what passed for an eyebrow among his species, and told her to play it. The message was simple. It had been drafted by a retired Russian general named Viktor Petrov, a man who had survived 2 wars and buried 3 sons, and had hands that shook when he held a pen, but did not shake when he held a rifle. And it had been co-signed by every sovereign nation on Earth, from the greatest powers to the smallest island states, all of them adding their names to a single document for the first time in human history. The message read, "We do not recognize your claim. Any attempt to land on our world will be considered an act of war. You have 24 hours to leave our system. There will be no further communication on this matter." Listen to the message twice, and then a third time, because he was certain something had been lost in translation. He ordered his linguistics team to verify every word, and they did, and they confirmed that the translation was perfect, and that the primitives had indeed just told the most powerful military force in the known galaxy to leave or face the consequences. For the first time in decades of service, Yuvrel felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, certainly not fear, but something close to curiosity, the way one might feel curious about an insect that had bitten them instead of flying away. He pulled up humanity's technological profile one more time. No FTL capability, no energy shields, no plasma weapons, no orbital defense network, nothing but chemical rockets and nuclear warheads and projectile weapons that literally threw small pieces of metal at high speed like some kind of barbaric joke. He almost laughed. He very nearly did. And then he straightened his uniform and addressed his bridge crew with the confidence of someone who had never lost and could not imagine losing. "Begin standard pacification," he said. "Tier 3 protocol. I want minimal damage to infrastructure and resources. This should be completed within 1 planetary rotation. Log this world as compliant by end of cycle." His officers acknowledged the order and began their preparations, and the great machinery of conquest that had swallowed 900 worlds began to turn once more. Far below, on the surface of the little blue planet, humanity watched the ships begin to move. And they did not run, and they did not hide, and they did not kneel. Instead, they loaded their weapons, and they kissed their families, and they looked up at the sky with eyes that burned, and they waited. Because the aliens had made the mistake that every invader in human history had eventually made. They had looked at the people they intended to conquer, and seen something small and weak and easy to break. They had not yet learned the truth that every empire that had ever tried to crush the human spirit had learned too late, that there was nothing on this world or any other that was more dangerous than a human being who had decided that this was the hill they would die on. The Valith were about to receive an education, and the tuition was going to be paid in blood. The first Valith dropships descended through Earth's atmosphere like burning arrows falling from heaven, and the soldiers inside them were calm because they had done this hundreds of times before, and it had always ended the same way, with silence and submission and the quiet shuffling of a conquered people lining up to be counted. The Tide soldiers were the Dominion's standard ground force, 7 feet tall, bred in vats for obedience and aggression, armored in living metal that healed itself when damaged, and carrying plasma rifles that could melt stone at 300 meters. They had marched into the capitals of dozens of worlds and watched entire civilizations fold like paper just from the sight of them. On the planet called Verath 6, the entire government had surrendered before a single shot was fired. On Kissian Prime, the population had wept and opened their gates within the hour. On Delvari, the ruling caste had offered their own people as tribute, just to avoid conflict. Earth was supposed to be the same, another quiet addition to the Dominion's ever-growing list. The first dropship to enter European airspace was codenamed Talon 7, and it carried 400 Tide soldiers and their commanding officer, a veteran named Salith, who had personally overseen the pacification of 11 worlds and had never once needed to request reinforcements. Talon 7 was 2 minutes from its designated landing zone in the fields outside Warsaw when the sky around it erupted in fire. The first missile came from the east, a Polish-made anti-aircraft system that had been designed to shoot down jets, not alien warships, but the engineers who built it had done their job well, and the targeting computer did not care whether its target was from this world or another. The missile struck Talon 7's port engine and tore through its hull like a fist through wet cardboard, and the dropship screamed and spun and crashed into the pond. Frozen ground, in a ball of flame that could be seen from 50 kilometers away. 312 Tide soldiers survived the crash. They pulled themselves from the wreckage and formed ranks and prepared to march on the nearest city, just as they had been trained to do. They made it 600 meters before the tree line exploded. Polish infantry, supported by German armored units and Czech special forces, had been waiting in prepared positions for hours. They opened fire with everything they had, and the sound of it rolled across the flat Polish countryside like the roar of some great and terrible beast waking up from a very long sleep. The Tide soldiers were tough. Their armor absorbed the first volley of conventional rounds, and their plasma rifles began to return fire with devastating effect, melting trees and turning foxholes into glass craters. But the humans did not break, and they did not run, and they kept firing and firing and firing, until barrels of their guns glowed red. And then the artillery began. Howitzers that had been positioned 10 kilometers behind the front line opened up with a thunder that shook the earth, and high explosive shells rained down on the alien formation like the hammer of an angry god. And the Tide soldiers, who had never faced artillery before, who had never known what it was like to have the ground itself try to kill them, began to falter. Salith watched from the secondary command ship in orbit, and felt the first cold finger of doubt touch the back of his mind. This was not how it was supposed to go. Across the world, the same scene played out in 1,000 different ways. In the mountains of Afghanistan, Valith scout patrols entered narrow valleys and never came out. The people who lived in those mountains had been fighting invaders for thousands of years, and they did not need advanced technology to kill. Only patience and knowledge of the terrain and a hatred for anyone who came to their land uninvited. In the jungles of Vietnam and Myanmar, guerrilla fighters who had inherited the tactics of their grandparents melted into the green and struck from nowhere. Valith soldiers would march through a forest path and find the point man dead with his throat cut, and no sign of the killer. Only the sound of the jungle birds singing, as if nothing had happened. In the cities of Nigeria and Kenya, militias armed with nothing but rifles and homemade explosives fought block by block, and every building became a fortress, and every alley became a killing ground. And the Valith learned very quickly that conquering a human city was like trying to hold water in your fists. In the deserts of the Middle East, veterans of 12 human wars turned their hard-won knowledge against a new enemy. They had spent decades learning how to fight the most powerful military on their own planet, and the skills they had developed transferred with terrifying efficiency to fighting aliens. IEDs began appearing on Valith's supply routes within 36 hours of the invasion. Crude bombs made from salvaged alien power cells wired to pressure plates and hidden beneath the sand. And when a Valith transport column rolled over them, the explosion was so powerful it left craters the size of swimming pools. The humans were learning. That was the part that frightened Sylith the most. Every engagement taught them something new about the enemy, how the Tide soldiers moved, where their armor was weakest, how their plasma rifles needed to cool between shots, how their communications could be jammed with the right frequency. And the humans shared this knowledge instantly, spreading it across the globe through encrypted channels and underground networks, and even old-fashioned runners carrying handwritten notes. Within 1 week, human forces had developed standardized tactics for fighting Valith ground troops. These tactics were being taught in basements and bunkers and forest camps on every continent. Then came Operation Burning Sky. UTC High Command had been planning it since the first hour of the invasion. A coordinated, global counterattack designed to hit every major Valith forward base simultaneously, and it was the largest military operation in the history of Earth. At exactly midnight Greenwich Mean Time, on March 22nd, the sky caught fire. In the wastelands of northern Canada, where the Valith had established their primary North American staging ground, 3 tactical nuclear weapons detonated in a perfect triangle around the base. The blasts were small by nuclear standards, precisely calculated to destroy the alien installation while minimizing fallout. And the white light of the explosions turned night into day for 300 kilometers in every direction. In the steppes of Central Asia, Russian and Chinese forces launched a combined armored assault, backed by cruise missiles and carpet bombing that overran a Valith communications hub in 4 hours of savage fighting. In the waters of the Pacific, submarines from 6 different navies torpedoed a Valith logistics ship that had been hovering above the ocean's surface, and the alien vessel, half a kilometer long and gleaming like polished bone, broke apart and sank beneath the waves, while human sailors watched from their conning towers and cheered. The Valith shields held against individual nuclear warheads, but they flickered and cracked under sustained bombardment. And this was a revelation that changed everything. The aliens were not invincible. Their technology was not magic, and with enough force and enough fury, they could be hurt. Meanwhile, in laboratories buried deep underground, humanity's scientists were performing miracles of desperation. Captured Valith technology was torn apart and studied by teams working in shifts around the clock, sleeping in their labs and eating at their desks, driven by the knowledge that every hour they spent understanding the enemy's tools was an hour that might save 1 million lives. At MIT, a team of engineers figured out how to read Valith data storage in 9 days. At CERN, physicists cracked the basic principles of plasma containment in 12. At IIT Bombay, a 23-year-old graduate student named Priya Sharma discovered that the frequency used by Valith communications could be disrupted by a modified radio transmitter, and within a week, her design was being mass-produced in factories on 4 continents. Salith sent his report to Yuvrel on the evening of the 2nd day, and his voice carried a weight that it had never carried before. "Ambassador Commandant," he said, "casualties in the first 48 hours have exceeded our total losses from the last 3 planetary conquests combined. I am requesting immediate reinforcement and a reassessment of our tactical approach." Yuvrel read the report in silence, and for the first time in his career, he did not have a protocol to reference, because the Dominion's protocols did not account for a species that fought like this. A censor officer on the Eternal Decree noticed something strange and brought it to Yuvrel's attention. On every world the Dominion had ever conquered, the planet's communication traffic dropped to near zero within hours, as despair and chaos took hold. But on Earth, the radio traffic was not decreasing. It was increasing. And it was not screaming, and it was not begging, and it was not the sound of a species dying. It was tactical coordinates being relayed between command posts, and supply routes being organized, and casualty reports being filed with cold efficiency, and encrypted messages bouncing between continents at the speed of light. And woven through all of it, like a thread of gold in a tapestry of iron, were things that made no sense to the Valith. Analysts at all, music. The humans were playing music on their military frequencies, loud and fierce and full of a terrible joy that had no translation in any Valith language. Jokes. They were laughing, telling each other stories in the spaces between battles, finding humor in the darkest moments, as if the act of laughing itself was a weapon. The humans were not breaking. They were not even bending. They were getting stronger, and they were getting angrier, and they were getting smarter, and the Valith had absolutely no idea what to do about it. Because in all their centuries of conquest, in all their 900 worlds, they had never encountered anything like this. They had never encountered a species that got more dangerous the harder you hit it. By the second week of the war, the Valith analysts aboard the Eternal Decree had identified something they could not explain. And after days of arguing among themselves, they gave it a name. They called it Total War, and the words tasted wrong in their mouths, because nothing like it existed anywhere in the Dominion's vast archives of conquered civilizations. In the Valith understanding of the universe, war was a thing done by soldiers. It was clean and contained, and separate from the rest of society, the way a surgeon's knife is separate from the body it cuts. Warriors fought, civilians produced, rulers negotiated, and when the fighting was done, life went on with a new flag flying overhead and new masters giving orders. This was how it worked on every world they had ever touched. This was how it worked across the entire galaxy as far as they knew. Because what rational species would throw its entire civilization into the fire of war? Built just to keep fighting one more day? Humans, it turned out, humans would. The transformation began on the third day and accelerated with a speed that left the Valith Intelligence Division scrambling to keep up. Car factories in Detroit and Stuttgart and Nagoya stopped making cars and started making armored vehicles. Not sleek military machines designed by committee over years of testing, but brutal, ugly things welded together from whatever was available, covered in steel plates and mounted with guns, rolling off the assembly lines 24 hours a day, while the workers slept in shifts on the factory floor. Textile mills that had been weaving cotton and silk began producing ballistic fabric and camouflage netting. Electronics factories switched from phones and computers to targeting systems and communication equipment. Chemical plants that had been making fertilizer and cleaning products started producing explosives and rocket fuel, emptied their classrooms, and turned their laboratories into weapons research centers. Professors who had spent their lives studying theoretical physics found themselves building plasma containment systems from captured alien technology, and they did it with a speed that would have been considered impossible a month earlier, because nothing motivates a scientist quite like the knowledge that their entire species will be wiped out if they fail. But it was not just the factories and the laboratories, it was everyone. Teenagers with 3D printers in their bedrooms began manufacturing drone components and distributing them to local militia units. Farmers in the American Midwest rigged their crop-dusting planes with improvised weapon mounts and flew them against Valith ground patrols. Fishermen in Southeast Asia strapped explosives to their boats and rammed them into alien landing craft. Grandmothers in Eastern Europe knitted camouflage netting and rolled bandages and cooked meals for soldiers and refused to evacuate their homes even when the fighting reached their front doors. A 12-year-old girl in Seoul wrote a program that could predict Valith patrol patterns based on intercepted communications. And her software was being used by military commanders within a week. A retired plumber in Buenos Aires figured out that Valith sensor equipment could be blinded by a specific combination of household chemicals. And his discovery was broadcast to resistance cells on every continent within hours. The global economy did not slow down or restructure or adapt. It simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form, and was replaced by something new. something that had no name because it had never existed before. A planetary war machine powered by 8 billion people, who had all decided at the same time that nothing mattered except winning. Old rivalries did not fade away gradually. They vanished overnight, burned to ash by a fire that made every human conflict in history look like a schoolyard argument. Indian and Pakistani soldiers, who had spent their entire careers staring at each other across a border that had been drawn in blood, now fought side by side in the same trenches, and bled the same red, and called each other brother. Israeli engineers and Iranian scientists worked together in underground laboratories, sharing knowledge that their governments had guarded as the most precious of secrets, because the secrets of nations meant nothing when the survival of the species was at stake. North and South Korean forces merged into a single command structure, in a ceremony that lasted less than 5 minutes and involved no speeches, and no flags, and no politicians. Just 2 generals shaking hands and getting to work. The UTC coordinated it all, from a command center buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps, a facility that had been built during the Cold War to survive nuclear apocalypse, and was now serving a purpose that its builders could never have imagined. And the results began to show on the battlefield. Human weapons evolved at a pace that terrified the Valith. In the first week, soldiers had fought with conventional bullets and explosives, and they had paid for every meter of ground with blood. By the third week, frontline units were carrying hybrid weapons that merged human ballistic technology with reverse-engineered Valith plasma systems. These weapons were crude and dangerous, and had an unfortunate tendency to overheat and explode in the hands of the soldiers using them. But when they worked, and they worked more often than not, they could punch through Tide soldier armor like it was made of paper. Human fighter jets were retrofitted with plasma cannons bolted to their wings with welded brackets and powered by alien energy cells wired into the airframe with electrical tape and prayer. They were ugly and unstable, and the pilots who flew them knew that every mission might end with their own weapons killing them before the enemy got the chance. And they flew anyway, because that was what needed to be done. Then came the Battle of the Sahara, and the Valith learned what happens when you march an army across open ground against a species that has been perfecting the art of killing for 10,000 years. Valith High Command had assembled their largest ground force, an armored column of over 2,000 vehicles and 30,000 Tide soldiers stretching across the desert like a river of metal, advancing toward the population centers of North Africa with the confidence of a force that believed itself unstoppable. UTC let them come. For 3 days, the column advanced without resistance, and the Valith commanders grew comfortable, believing that the humans had finally recognized the futility of fighting. They did not realize that every step they took was being tracked by satellites and drones and human scouts, hidden in the sand, and that the desert they were marching through had been prepared for them like a dinner table set for guests who would not be leaving. On the 4th day, at exactly noon, the trap was sprung. Thermobaric weapons, hundreds of them, buried along a 200-kilometer front, detonated simultaneously, and the desert floor erupted in a wall of fire that reached higher than the clouds and burned hotter than the surface of a star. The firestorm consumed everything in its path. Valith vehicles melted like wax. Tide soldier armor ran like water. The sand itself turned to glass that reflected the flames like a mirror stretching to the horizon, and the shockwave that followed flattened everything that the fire had missed. The explosion was visible from orbit, and the Valith officers watching from their ships saw a scar burned into the face of the earth that was 200 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide, glowing orange and red like a wound in the skin of the planet. An entire Valith mechanized division, a largest ground force the Dominion had deployed on Earth, was gone, wiped from existence in a single moment of calculated, merciless fury. It was the worst single engagement loss the Dominion had suffered in over 400 years, and it had been inflicted by a species that the Vaylith had classified as technologically primitive. 3 days later came the Mumbai offensive. Human forces launched a counterattack to retake the city in what became the most savage urban battle in the history of either species. The fighting lasted 9 days. 9 days of room-to-room, floor-to-floor, hand-to-hand combat in a city of 20 million people who had refused to leave their homes. The Tide soldiers were enormous and powerful and terrifying in open ground. But in the narrow streets and crumbling buildings and flooded basements of Mumbai, their size became a weakness. Every alley and every rooftop and every sewer tunnel turned the city into a nightmare of ambushes and traps and sudden violence. Human losses were staggering, thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded. And they did not stop. Not for 1 second, not for one breath, pushing forward through the rubble and the smoke and the blood, until the last Vaylith soldier in the city was dead or captured. Yuvrel received the reports and sat in silence for a very long time. And then he did something he had never done in his entire career. He sent a request to Dominion High Command for reinforcements. The response came back within hours, and it carried the tone of superiors who were not merely disappointed, but genuinely confused. Yuvrel commanded a fleet that had conquered worlds, and he was asking for help against a species that could not even leave its own planet? They sent him a fraction of what he had requested, and a message that was polite on the surface, but carried an unmistakable warning beneath. Failure would not be understood, and it would not be forgiven. Yuvrel read the message, and deleted it, and stared out the window of his bridge at the little blue world below. And for the first time, he wondered if he was looking at something the Dominion had never faced before. Not just an enemy, but a force of nature, wearing the skin of a civilization. Deep beneath the Swiss Alps, in a laboratory lit by fluorescent lights and the glow of alien technology, a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez wiped the sweat from her forehead and stared at the numbers on her screen, and checked them again, and then checked them a third time, because what they were telling her was impossible. But the numbers did not change, and they were not wrong. She picked up the encrypted phone that connected directly to UTC High Command, and her hand was shaking, and her voice was steady, and she said 7 words that changed the course of the war and the future of humanity forever. We cracked their FTL drive. We can build one. And somewhere in the vast cold silence of space, the rules of the game changed forever, because the wolves had just learned to fly. For 3 months, humanity had been fighting with its back against the wall, bleeding and burning and dying in numbers that would have broken any other species in the galaxy. But humans are not built like other species, and the wall they had been pressed against was not a dead end. It was a launching pad. In the deepest oceans of Earth, in shipyards carved into the rock of the seafloor where no Vaylith sensor could reach, something was being built. And in the hollowed-out hearts of asteroids dragged into Earth's orbit by captured alien engines, something more was taking shape. And in underground facilities on 6 continents, working around the clock in shifts that blurred day and night into one endless stream of welding sparks and shouted orders and the hum of machinery that never stopped, humanity was building its answer to the stars. They called them warships, but that word was too elegant for what they actually were. They were ugly, brutal slabs of reinforced steel and salvaged alien alloy, covered in armor plating 3 meters thick, bristling with weapons that ranged from nuclear missile launchers to reverse-engineered plasma cannons to simple kinetic railguns that could hurl a tungsten slug at a fraction of the speed of light. They had no curves and no grace and no beauty, and they looked exactly like what they were. Weapons built by a species that cared about nothing except hitting the enemy as hard as physically possible. The Veilith built their ships like artists. Humanity built theirs like fists. Dr. Elena Vasquez had cracked the principles of FTL travel, but turning those principles into a working drive system required the combined effort of every physicist, engineer, and mathematician left alive on the planet. The first prototype exploded and killed 47 people, and the second prototype tore a hole in space that took 3 days to close, and the third prototype worked for exactly 11 seconds before burning out. The fourth prototype worked. It was not smooth, it was not comfortable. The humans who rode the first test flight described the experience as being turned inside out while falling down a flight of stairs made of lightning. But it worked, and that was all that mattered. Within weeks, humanity had a fleet. They called it Wolfpack 1, and it consisted of 12 warships, crewed by volunteers, who knew they were flying into the unknown in machines that had been built in 3 months by people who had learned alien physics from scratch. The odds of survival were not discussed, because discussing them would not have changed anyone's mind. The commander of Wolfpack 1 was a woman named Captain Sarah Chen, a former fighter pilot who had shot down 3 Veilith atmospheric craft during the Battle of Shanghai and had the burn scars covering half her face to prove it. She had volunteered for the mission the moment she heard about it, and when asked why, she had smiled with the half of her mouth that still worked, and said, "Because someone has to go up there and punch them in the teeth." The target was the Veilith Orbital Command Station, a massive structure hanging above the moon like a second satellite, bristling with weapons and sensors and communication arrays that coordinated the entire invasion force. Taking it out would blind the enemy and cut their ground troops off from orbital support. The Veilith did not know Wolfpack 1 existed. They could not conceive of its existence, because in the entire history of the Dominion, no pre-contact species had ever achieved orbital military capability, let alone FTL travel, and certainly not during an active invasion. It was like expecting a fish to build a helicopter while you were in the middle of catching it. Captain Shen gave the order to engage at 0300 hours on a Tuesday, because she believed that even aliens might be less alert in the small hours of the morning. She was right. Wolfpack 1 dropped out of FTL in a ragged formation less than 50 kilometers from the station, and for 3 seconds, nothing happened. 3 seconds in which the Veilith sensor operators stared at their screens and tried to understand what they were seeing, because what they were seeing was impossible. Then the shooting started. 12 human warships opened fire simultaneously with everything they had: nuclear missiles and plasma beams and railgun slugs and conventional torpedoes and anything else that could be aimed and triggered. And the Veilith station, which had been designed to withstand attacks from known galactic threats, was hit by a volume of fire so intense and so varied that its shield systems could not adapt fast enough. The Battle of Luna lasted 47 minutes, and it was the most violent 47 minutes in the history of space warfare. The station's shields held for the first 8 minutes, and then began to flicker. As the sustained bombardment overloaded their power systems, human ships took terrible damage in return, with 3 of the 12 destroyed in the first exchange alone, their crews dying in fire and vacuum without a sound. But the remaining 9 pressed forward, closing the distance until they were so close that the station's heavy weapons could not depress far enough to target them. Captain Chen drove her flagship directly into the station's shield envelope and fired her railguns point-blank into the hull. The kinetic slugs punched through the weakened shields and tore through the station's interior like bullets through a tin can, and the station began to break apart, explosions blooming along its surface like flowers made of fire. When it was over, the Veilith Orbital Command Station was a field of spinning debris, and humanity owned the space above its own world for the first time since the invasion began. On the ground, the effect was immediate and devastating. Without orbital support, Veilith ground forces lost their surveillance, their communications relay, their ability to call in strikes from space, and their connection to the fleet. They were alone, surrounded, outnumbered by a species that had been waiting for exactly this moment. City after city was liberated in a wave of fury that swept across the planet. Human forces attacked with everything they had, pouring into Veilith-held territory with tanks and infantry and aircraft and things that did not have names yet, because they had been invented last week. And the Tide soldiers, for the first time in their engineered existence, experienced an emotion that their creators had deliberately removed from their genetic code: fear. They felt it in the streets of Cairo when human soldiers came out of the sewers behind them. They felt it in the forests of Siberia when the trees themselves seemed to come alive with gunfire. They felt it in the ruins of Sao Paulo when a Veilith company surrendered to a force of human fighters that turned out to be half the size of their own, because the humans had attacked with such ferocity that the aliens had believed they were facing an army. And then came the siege of the flagship. Ambassador Commandant Yuvril had watched the destruction of his orbital station from the bridge of the Eternal Decree, and for the first time in his life, he had felt the cold hand of genuine fear close around his heart. But he was a professional, and he still commanded the most powerful ship in the system, and he believed that even without the station, his flagship's weapons and shields could hold against anything the humans can throw at him. He was wrong about that too. The human boarding parties came in small assault craft, ugly little boxes of welded metal with no shields and no weapons, just engines and a pressurized cabin full of Marines in jury-rigged EVA suits, carrying plasma cutters and shotguns and combat knives. They crossed the gap between the human fleet and the Eternal Decree at full speed, weaving through defensive fire that destroyed half of them before they reached the hull. The survivors did not slow down. They slammed into the flagship's outer hull, cut through the armor with their plasma torches, and poured inside like water through a cracked dam. The fighting in the corridors of the Eternal Decree was something that would haunt Veilith survivors for the rest of their lives. The ship had not been designed for internal combat, because no enemy had ever gotten close enough to board a Veilith flagship, and its wide corridors and open compartments became killing grounds where humans excelled. The Tide soldiers were bigger and stronger and better armored, but the humans were faster in close quarters, and they fought with a savage creativity that no amount of genetic engineering could match. They used the ship's own systems against its crew, venting compartments, triggering fire suppression systems to blind their enemies, cutting power to sections, and fighting in the dark, where human adaptability gave them the edge. Yuvrel retreated to his bridge as the fighting closed in around him, and in those final minutes, he did something that surprised even himself. He pulled up every file the Dominion had ever compiled on humanity, and read through their history with the desperate focus of a man trying to solve a puzzle before the clock ran out. He read about their wars, thousands of them, stretching back to the dawn of their civilization, fought over land and resources and religion and ideology, and sometimes for no reason at all except that someone had drawn a line and someone else had crossed it. He read about the death tolls, the millions and tens of millions killed in conflicts that would have ended any other species in the galaxy. He read about their weapons, each generation more terrible than the last, progressing from stones to steel to atoms with a relentless momentum that nothing had ever stopped. And he understood, finally, what the Dominion had done. They had not invaded a primitive world. They had kicked open the door of a cage that the humans had built around themselves to keep the galaxy safe from what they were. And now the door was open, and the thing inside was awake, and it was angry, and it was free. The bridge doors opened, and human soldiers poured in with their weapons raised, and their faces hard behind their visors. And Yuvril looked at them, and felt something that was not fear, and not respect, but something deeper. The recognition of a predator meeting another predator and knowing, with absolute certainty, which one of them was more dangerous. He was offered surrender, and he accepted. The first Valith commander to surrender in over 1,000 years. The war for Earth was over. But as the celebrations erupted across the planet, and billions of voices rose in a roar of triumph that could almost be heard in space, the sensors on humanity's new warships detected something at the edge of the solar system. A second fleet, far larger than the first, hundreds of capital ships arranged in a formation that the captured Valith databases identified as one thing and one thing only: an extermination fleet. The Dominion was done playing games. They were coming to wipe humanity from existence. And humanity looked at the armada gathering in the darkness beyond their world, and did not despair, and did not weep, and did not pray for mercy. They smiled, because now they had ships, and now they had weapons, and now they had 3 months to prepare. And 3 months was more than enough. The extermination fleet arrived on a Thursday, and it was the most terrifying thing any human had ever seen. 600 capital ships, each one a mountain of metal and fire stretching kilometers from bow to stern, emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system in a formation so precise and so vast that it looked like a wall being built across the stars, brick by brick, until the darkness itself seemed to have a shape, and that shape was death. Grand Arbiter Fessin stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Silence of Worlds, and looked at the tiny blue dot in the distance that had caused the Dominion more trouble than any world in its 1,000-year history. He was the most decorated military commander in the Valith Empire, a strategist who had crushed rebellions and broken alliances and erased civilizations that had existed for longer than this little species had been walking upright. He had been given one order: erase the species, and ensure that no record of this humiliation survived. And he intended to carry it out with the cold efficiency that had made him a legend. But humanity had not been idle during those 3 months. The inner solar system had been transformed into a fortress. Asteroid belts had been seeded with nuclear mines. Mars and the moons of Jupiter hosted weapons platforms built from scavenged alien technology. Communication satellites had been converted into kinetic kill vehicles, and the space between Earth and the outer system was a labyrinth of traps and sensors and automated defense systems that covered every approach like a web spun by a spider the size of a planet. Humanity's fleet had grown. No longer 12 ships, but over 100, built in the same brutal style as the first, crewed by volunteers from every nation, every culture, every corner of the world, farmers and teachers and students and grandparents and criminals and saints, trained in 3 months to do a job that should have taken years. All of them knowing that the odds were against them, none of them caring. They called themselves the Terran Defense Fleet, and their ships carried names that told the story of what they were fighting for. The Mumbai, the Warsaw, the Lagos, the Shanghai, the Sao Paulo, the Defiance. Each name a scar from the invasion. Each scar a reminder of what had been lost and what would never be lost again. Captain Sarah Chen, promoted to Admiral after the Battle of Luna, commanded the fleet from the bridge of her new flagship, the TFS Fury. She looked at the wall of enemy ships on her tactical display and felt her scarred face pull tight as she smiled, because Sarah Chen had been afraid many times in her life, but she had never once let fear stop her from doing what needed to be done. The Battle of Sol began at dawn, not Earth's dawn, because there is no dawn in space, but the moment when Admiral Chen opened a channel to every human ship, and every human installation, and every human being listening on every frequency, and said 5 words that would be remembered for as long as humanity existed. All ships, give them hell. The first wave of Valith fighters met the outer defense line at the orbit of Mars, and the nuclear mines detonated in a chain reaction that turned the space between the planets into a corridor of fire. Valith fighters by the hundreds were consumed in the blasts, and the capital ships behind them shuddered as the electromagnetic pulse washed over their shields like a wave breaking against a cliff. Thesson was not concerned. He had expected resistance, and losses at this stage were acceptable. He ordered his fleet forward through the debris field, and 600 capital ships advanced in perfect formation toward the inner system. They hit the second defense line at the asteroid belt, and this time the traps were different. Hollowed-out asteroids, and filled them with engines and explosives, turning them into guided missiles the size of mountains. And when they fired their engines and hurled themselves at the Valith fleet, the impacts were so powerful that they cracked capital ship hulls like eggshells. But Thesson's fleet was vast, and it absorbed the losses and kept coming. And the Grand Arbiter allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The humans were creative, he would grant them that. But creativity alone could not overcome the sheer weight of numbers he had brought to bear. Then the human fleet engaged, and Thesson's satisfaction died. 100 human warships met 600 Valith capital ships in the space between Mars and Earth, and what followed was the largest and most violent naval engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. A battle so immense that the light from the weapons fire was visible from Earth's surface as a flickering glow across the night sky. Thunderstorm raging among the stars. The humans were outnumbered 6-1, and they attacked. Not defended, not held position, not retreated to more favorable ground. They attacked, driving straight into the heart of the Valith formation with their engines at full power and their weapons blazing, and the savagery of the charge caught even Thesson off guard. Human ships fought with a recklessness that defied every tactical model in the Valith database. When their weapons failed, they rammed, driving their armored bows into enemy hulls like battering rams. When their engines were hit, they used their remaining maneuvering thrusters to spin in place and bring undamaged weapons to bear. When their hulls were breached, the crews sealed their suits and kept fighting in vacuum, choking on their own recycled air while they loaded weapons by hand. The TFS Mumbai took a plasma beam through its midsection that cut the ship nearly in half. Forward section sealed the breach and continued fighting for another 40 minutes, destroying 2 Valith cruisers before a second hit finished them. The TFS Warsaw lost all engine power and drifted into the path of a Valith battleship. Its captain ordered all remaining power to weapons and fired every missile in the ship's magazines in a single broadside that gutted the enemy vessel from stem to stern, before both ships exploded in a fireball that briefly outshone the sun. Pilots flew suicide runs into the engines of Valith capital ships, not because they were ordered to, but because they could see that the ship they were targeting was about to fire on a populated area of Earth, and they decided in that moment that their one life was a fair trade for 1,000,000, and they did not hesitate, and they did not scream, and they flew straight and true into the fire. Thesson watched his tactical display and felt the first crack appear in his confidence. His models had predicted that at 40% casualties, any rational species would begin surrender negotiations. The human fleet had passed 40% casualties 20 minutes ago, and they were not surrendering. They were accelerating. At 60% casualties, Thesson's models predicted total collapse, the point at which no military force in galactic history had ever continued fighting. The human fleet hit 60% casualties, and the surviving ships formed into a tight spearhead formation and drove directly at Thesson's flagship, punching through 3 defensive lines of Valith warships to reach him. They were not retreating. They were not negotiating. They were not doing anything that made sense according to any tactical doctrine the Dominion had ever known. They were bleeding and burning and dying, and they were still coming, faster and harder and more furious with every ship they lost. as if the deaths of their comrades were fuel being poured on a fire that could not be extinguished. And that was when the Veilith broke. Not the humans, the Veilith. Individual captains watching the carnage on their screens and seeing an enemy that simply would not stop no matter how many of them died, began to lose their nerve. A Veilith cruiser on the left flank broke formation and turned away, and then another, and then 5 more. And then the trickle became a flood, as ship after ship decided that whatever was on that blue world was not worth the price of fighting it. Fessin screamed orders into his communicator, demanding that his captains hold the line, threatening courts-martial and execution and disgrace. But his voice was drowned out by the chaos of a fleet that had fought 1,000 battles and won them all and was now, for the first time, running from an enemy that scared them more than their own commanders did. The Grand Arbiter stood alone on his bridge as his fleet disintegrated around him, and he activated his personal log and spoke into the silence with a voice that was calm and quiet, and carried the weight of a man who had just watched everything he believed in collapse. "We misunderstood what we found here," he said. "This is not a species that fights to survive. This is a species that was built for war. Every cell in their bodies, every thought in their minds, every beat of their hearts is tuned to conflict in a way that we cannot match and cannot comprehend. We did not invade them, we woke them up, and the galaxy will never forgive us for what we have unleashed." Human Marines boarded the Silence of Worlds and found Fessin sitting in his command chair, waiting. He surrendered without resistance, and as the human soldiers led him away, he looked at their faces and saw something that chilled him to his core. They were not celebrating, they were not gloating, they were not drunk on victory. They were already planning what came next. The war was over. Extermination Fleet was shattered, its remnants fleeing into deep space, with stories that would spread across the galaxy like wildfire. And on Earth, 8 billion voices rose in a sound that had no name, a roar of grief and triumph and fury and love, all woven together, because they had paid for this victory with millions of lives and oceans of blood, and they would carry those scars forever. But they were alive. Humanity was alive, and for the first time in its history, it was not alone among the stars. News of Earth's victory traveled across the galaxy at the speed of light and rumor, carried by traders and refugees and escaped prisoners and Veilith deserters who told anyone who would listen about the small blue world that had done the impossible. Conquered worlds began to whisper, and then to shout, and then to rise, because if the humans could fight and win, then maybe, just maybe, so could they. The Dominion's grip, unbroken for 1,000 years, began to crumble. Crack. Earth's first true interstellar warship, the TFS Defiance, launched from orbit 6 months after the battle, carrying humanity's message to every world and every species and every corner of the galaxy that could hear it. And the message was not a threat, and not a plea, and not a demand. It was a promise. We came from a small blue world at the edge of nothing. We fought each other for 10,000 years. We split the atom, scarred our own skies, and nearly destroyed ourselves more times than we can count. And when the universe came to take what was ours, we said no. We are humanity. We do not kneel, we do not break, and we are coming, not to conquer, not to rule, but to stand beside any world that refuses to bow, because we know what it means to fight alone, and no one should have to. Across 1,000 worlds, 1,000 species heard the message. Some felt hope for the first time in generations, and some felt terror at what this new power might become, and all of them understood one simple truth that would reshape the galaxy for centuries to come. The age of the Dominion was ending, and the age of humanity had just begun.